All right, everybody. Well, welcome to our artist talk this evening. So happy to see all of your faces here on my screen. Welcome to tonight's conversation with Lynne Harlow. Lynne is on my upper left. Lynne, you want to say hello to everybody?
Hey, everyone. I'm so glad you're here.
Yes, and welcome to everyone at home, in studio, virtual backgrounds. And Ben, I think, is driving. So Ben, keep your eyes on the road. Really happy you're all here. And tonight, obviously, we are here to talk about Lynne Harlow's new exhibition. Many of you have seen it. It continues, it just opened a week ago, so it's going to continue through early June. The exhibition is called Lodestar, and we could not be more excited to present it. This is our fourth project with Lynne, fourth solo exhibition. We've done lots of other additional projects at venues far and wide, lots of group shows together, and you know, Lynne is one of our earliest collaborators, really, since the inception of this project. In fact, I had an opportunity to meet and work with Lynne before we knew each other. We're working artists. So Lynne, we will talk about that just in a little bit. So back in the 90s, anyone remember the 90s here? Yes, many of you hopefully do. Okay, good. Yes, the 90s. So way back. As I mentioned, we are recording tonight. I will post that recording up on YouTube. You can feel free to keep your videos on, turn them off if you're more comfortable. I'm going to ask all of you to mute yourselves, though, just so we keep the kind of interference and noise reverb potential down to a minimum. Feel free to put up your names, your gender pronouns, if that's comfortable for you up on the screen. I want to make this as welcoming and comfortable for everyone as humanly possible. And we are going to open up our conversation like we always do, with about 20 minutes left to go. So around 7:40, maybe a little earlier, maybe a little later. I'll turn the conversation over to all of you so you can ask questions, and I'm sure you have plenty of Lynne. I've prepared a few, of course, to kind of get things started, but know that we will have a conversation shortly. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Matthew Delegate. I'm the co-founder and co-director of Minus Space. I'm an artist like many of you. I've had the great pleasure of working in the gallery that we've all collaboratively built together. I've curated a bunch of shows over the last 20 years. I get to teach in a lot of different places that keep inviting me back because I believe they have got something to say. I get to teach at SVA, the School of Visual Arts, alongside Chris Giannakos, which I'm really pleased about. Different departments, but just knowing Chris is there sometimes, crossing paths I just absolutely love. Tonight, of course, we're going to be talking about Lynne Harlow and your work and your ideas concerning Lodestar. And for those of you that don't know Lynne just yet, I believe all of you do at this point. I will say that she's based in Providence, Rhode Island. She comes into New York and was based in New York for a very long time, went to Hunter College. And Lynne, you've been in New York City twice in the last 2 weeks. So you're pretty frequently going back and forth, which we love. Lots of activities sort of like in both cities. So this is just something I wanted to point out. She's exhibited her work nationally and internationally for more than 25 years. In countries including Mexico, France, Germany, Italy, Norway, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, and all over the United States, so far and wide. As I mentioned, you've organized 4 solo shows with us, the first one being Beat back in, what is it, Lynne, 2007? That is crazy long ago. Crazy long ago. And we'll talk a little bit about Beat in collaboration later today. You were, of course, also in our big survey exhibition, Minus Space in Oaxaca, back in 2012, and our big survey show at PS1 MoMA back in 2008, which was curated by Fong Bui. So lots and lots of projects. Your work was included in the 2013 Decor de Vote Biennial. You've shown your work at museums far and wide, including PS1, the Herbert F. Johnson Museum, Brattleboro Museum, RISD Museum, South Bend Museum of Art, and many others. You've received awards from the Pollock Krasner Foundation, and they were, of course, really sort of very seminal in helping seed your ideas for the works that are on view here at the gallery, particularly the cast glass works. I want to just give a shout out to awesome funders everywhere. Thank you. You have no idea where this money is going to go and what you will seed with us streamers, artists, and troublemakers. So thank you for that support. Paula Krasner specifically. You've also received funding from the Rhode Island State Council on the Arts, the Rhode Island Foundation, and many, many others. Your work has been reviewed far and wide, Lynne, Art Forum, Two Coats of Paint, New York Times, the Boston Globe, so well published and discussed. And you've got your work in museum collections, including the Museum of Modern Art, the Met, and many, many, many others far and wide. You're a member of American Abstract Artists. This is a big core artist community group that still exists, founded originally in 1936. This is almost 100 years, and we still have the need to talk to each other and organize exhibitions and publish journals. So that I feel like is an evergreen thing that we artists always do. And as I mentioned, you earned your MFA at Hunter and your BA from Framingham State College in Massachusetts. So Lynne Harlow, welcome to our conversation. So excited. Hello, thanks for coming here. And thanks for putting on such a great show. Now, the title of your show, Lynne, is Lodestar. What exactly is a Lodestar? What is it? How did you come up with this? How is your work related to this term? So take it from the top.
Well, thank you all for being here. I'm happy to dive in and talk about Lodestar. The term is such a beautiful word to me because it references a star that is a guide in the sky. So the North Star in particular is often referred to that way, but it can be other stars that people are using to navigate. And this idea of navigation and movement through space, movement through the world is something that has been at the heart of my work right from the beginning. It certainly drives the way I think about installation work because in those pieces, we are literally walking through them. But for these particular pieces that come from rocks that I have gathered from really important parts of the world, personally important, those locations feel like guides to me. They inform how I navigate the world. And it just felt like the right term for this grouping.
Great. This grouping, and I would say, if I may project for this sort of like moment in time, culturally, politically, post-pandemic, post-Trump presidency, where I feel like we need sort of that lodestar, that Polaris North Star more than probably ever, right, Lynne?
Absolutely, yes. And when I started to make this work, it was when it physically started being made, we were really in the throes of COVID. A lot of the ideas leading up to the work preceded the pandemic, but are very wrapped up in the Trump years. So those two sets of events are the backdrop for this work. And yeah, the idea that we can use some guidance and to put our faith in something moving forward seems pretty relevant.
Fabulous. Yeah, absolutely. And I know that you don't speak about politics per se in your work very often, but I feel like this kind of context in which you made this work, I think cannot be dismissed. I think it's really critically important. And this lodestar term is such a positive one, right? I mean, it's such a sort of a guiding light. I'm sitting often outside my backyard looking at stars. So like understanding like where you are and the grand scheme of the swirling universe, I think is pretty amazing. So I really responded strongly to this term lodestar. Now, the works on view in your show are really consisting of kind of two new bodies of work. The first body that you, I think, probably see when you come into your show are these, we'll kind of lean out of the way, these works that are on a table platform, and they are all cast glass, right? Which is a totally new medium for you. Haven't done that before, although you've worked with transparency and plexi often. And then the other works over the other shoulder are works on panel that many would assume, and I've answered already probably 20 questions about this, that they are not paintings on panel, but rather fiber works mounted on panel. So they're made of silk that's laminated onto kind of wooden panels. So you've got basically two new bodies that are really closely dovetailed together that are on view at the same time in this show. Let's start with the glass works. Where did this idea come from to start working with glass, to start working with casting, to start working with crystal? Like, where on earth did this come from?
I have had this happen several times over the course of my art making where I've had an idea that felt very appealing, and then I backed off and thought, this is none of my business. And glass was one of those moments. I have a very long history of working with transparent materials, things that filter color, filter light, but in the past, they tend to be pretty commercial, mass-produced things like fabric, plexiglass, screen. There's a whole variety of things like that that I have used. And I started to think about whether glass would be the right kind of next step based on those characteristics. But the thing that initially held me back was the idea that all the other materials I've worked with have traditionally been very lightweight. And there's such a heft to glass. You know, there's that really beautiful weightiness to it. But I was concerned that that didn't align with what I was thinking about in the moment. So I put that thought on hold for a little while. And a lot of these rocks come from different locations in Maine, in an area that I visit every summer. And just a few summers ago, I was sitting on this particularly great stretch of coastline that I hadn't visited before. It was just a different stretch. And I was sitting there picking up rocks, just picking them up, really kind of enjoying everything about them. And in that moment, I made the realization that that weight of glass was actually a really exciting thing to me, feeling the weight of those rocks. And I thought, I do want to figure out how to take this kind of weighty material and weave it into the conversation that I already have going with these other materials.
Yeah,
and
because your works have been so like light, sort of like light and ethereal, fabrics moving, rain curtain, which is sort of a vinyl sort of slit fabric material, colored light, which really has no kind of like mass to it in a way. So this kind of switch is very object-like. It's very sculptural in a way, right?
Yeah, it's dense materiality in a way that I've never really explored before. And even though I didn't feel ready in that moment on the coast in Maine to make this plan to work in glass, I grabbed one rock that day with the idea that if I do move forward with this, this is the rock I want to work from. And that ended up being the very first rock that we cast. It is residing in the office at the gallery right now. And it in a sense was the lodestar for this whole project.
Fabulous. Yeah. So just when you stop by the gallery, you can ask me to see this rock. Again, we have it there not as sort of like, oh, this is like translates into glass and sculpture. It's there more sort of a pedagogical touchstone, lodestar kind of a concept. So if you're interested in seeing what this looks like, the kind of the origin of this, I've got it in safekeeping, Lynne Harlow at the gallery in the office. So you made the decision that if you arrived at this idea with this rock, you could start working in glass. How did you go about doing that? Because suddenly casting things into glass is a pretty technical process. So how did that come about?
When I came home from Maine with my special rock, I made the decision to apply to the Pollock Krasner Foundation to request a grant for exactly that pursuit. And about a year later, well, more than a year later, I was awarded the grant to do exactly that. And I needed to make some decisions about who to work with, right? Because it's not like I was going to learn how to cast glass completely by myself. You know, this kind of expertise takes decades. So I started to explore a lot of different options. And in this miraculous moment, someone locally around Rhode Island suggested that I reach out to a glass artist who's in the area, who's very skilled at casting, thinking that either he might be able to help me or he might know someone who could. That artist, Steve Easton, is in fact the person who has overseen all the fabrication of this project. And we have had this really terrific trajectory together. When we first talked and I described to him that I had an interest in building my material vocabulary and expanding my work into glass, but that I didn't really know about how it behaves and what it might do, he had a great suggestion to start with just some simple projects for me to learn the material itself. At that time, I was also in the middle of a pretty significant body of work that was all using triangle forms. This one particular right triangle, one specific orientation that I was making in a lot of different materials. And so we made the decision to make some glass triangles as just a way to wade into the process and help me understand what color does in the kiln, how the material behaves, how much and how little it can be controlled, right? And that's a really exciting piece of this, that you can set everything up. It's a little like printmaking too. You can set everything up, get it as plotted out as you want, and then you just have to see what the glass and the kiln give back to you. So we worked together for several months, making some triangles. I was very, very happy with, very excited about. And we found that we also worked really well together. So I knew I had found my person for this project. And at that point, we cast the first rock. And we did it in 2 opaque colors and also clear transparent glass, just so I could start to see the differences in those. And it was magical. When those things came out of their molds, it was just dynamite. And it was clear to me that this really was a project I wanted to pursue. And in each of those steps, Steve has been great about teaching me the mold making process and helping me to understand what's happening each step of the way. But as I've said, I couldn't possibly do this myself, and I'm very lucky to have found the right fabricator.
Fabulous. And Steve, actually, I don't know if some of you had a chance to meet him, but he came to the opening. I mean, that's how cool this guy is. I mean, he came all the way down from Rhode Island to be present and represent. And I will also add that he is a very skilled and accomplished artist unto his own right. So he's like working and making his own work, and he's also like collaborating. And I feel like that collaborative, generous kind of open studio is ideal. It's virtuous in my opinion, but super nice guy. And he sort of walked you through this process of how one goes about taking a rock off the beach in Maine and creating a mold for it and casting it in glass, right?
Right.
And you were saying that each of the rocks that we have on that table behind me, I'm going to lean over, is sort of a one-off. So you take a rock and you can only really create one mold from that rock at a time, correct? Meaning you don't make a mold that's then reused and reused and reused over and over again.
The mold making is a 2-part process. There is a rubber mold that's made initially, and then a composite kind of plaster and other material mold that's made later in the process, using a lost wax kind of traditional process. We were able in a few cases to reuse some of the initial rubber molds, but each time you use them to make a new plaster mold, you get something a little bit different. And then what happens in the kiln also changes things a little bit. So in the end, every one of those is completely unique, even if they started out from the same rock and even the same rubber mold.
Exactly. And I feel like that's a really important thing here. So these works are, on the table you will see when you come visit. There are individual rocks that have been cast in several types of glass, crystal or a ultramarine blue or this beautiful kind of amber brown. But they are all unique objects just because of the nature of the process that you're involved in, right? These are not like editioned out, mass-produced things. They're one of a kind. And even the rock is different every time, it seems like.
That's exactly right. I think that it's a stretch to imagine even making an edition of one of these. Maybe in some sort of really high-tech commercial facility that would be possible, but that wasn't my goal at all. I wanted each of them to have their very own unique character.
Fabulous. Before we get into the sort of the specifics of the rocks, could you talk about the sort of the dynamic between the two of you, between you and Steve, and how that worked out? I mean, I bring this up because a number of the artists that we work with also work in collaboration with other kind of either artists or like master craftspeople or fabricators for their work. I'm thinking here of Chris and his work that he's done with stonemasons, or the works that you've done with master printers. I'm thinking of Emmy Winter's work and her work with master weavers down in Oaxaca, Mexico, where she's originally from. So what was that dynamic like? Clearly you found the right person, but what did it look like? I'm just curious to hear this.
In referring to his working with me as being a very generous thing, you are so right. He wasn't simply making these because he could. He was so invested in this process with me, and he really got me to think about so many of the questions that were at the heart of how these things were really going to look and feel. So the thing I loved about it was that I was working with somebody who was not only really, really skilled and smart, but just so kind to be with. He's a really terrific person, and that made the whole process a pleasure. And I loved learning at every step. You know, I felt like I was fully engaged rather than just dropping something off with a fabricator. Call me when it's done. It wasn't that kind of experience. So between his enthusiasm for the project and my desire to really learn as much as I could, we spent a lot of time together in various phases of the work's development.
I absolutely love this. And this is interesting. This is not, I mean, I will add that this is not the first time you've worked with collaborators, but this is such a different way that you've worked with collaborators. I mentioned your piece that we presented back in 2007, which was Beat, which was essentially, for those of you that are maybe didn't have a chance to see the show or unaware of it, Lynne had painted a very large yellow square on one wall of our tiny pocket gallery we used to have, and set up a drum kit, a white drum kit in front of it, and then hired, kind of solicited drummers off of Craigslist to kind of come to our space at a given moment and time to perform on the drum kit. Totally sort of like open-ended. So again, this kind of collaboration and the realization is very different in the case with Steve and the work that you were doing. And I feel like that's really fascinating to be working side by side and not like phoning orders in, which is also a, you know, a verified, like Rodchenko did this, like, call me when it's done, make 3 of these, this kind of a thing, which I feel is really exciting. So let's talk about specifically the rocks. The questions I have been receiving, we've only been open a week, but I've gotten so many questions from people that are like, oh my God, tell me more about this. There are how many different rocks on view, like different places that you have collected rocks?
I believe there are 11.
Yeah, I would say probably a dozen, right?
Yeah.
And the rocks are primarily from where? From Maine, from what I understand.
They are mostly from down East Maine. A spot that we go to every summer, specifically because we have very, very dear friends there who we love to spend time with. And I would never have made it to that part of Maine, I think, under any other circumstances. So I am so grateful to them. And I feel like in many ways, this project really is a reflection of this very special friendship we have. So more than half of them, I think easily 3/4 of these, come from different places along the coast in down East Maine. But the thing that is so really amazing about this relatively small area is that on this one peninsula where we spend a lot of time, when you go from one piece of coastline to another, the rocks vary so greatly. So, you know, a kind of smooth round rock that you'll find on one beach isn't anywhere to be found in this other area where everything's really jagged and almost faceted. A little ways up the road, there is a beach where almost all the rocks are jasper, just in this one particular location. So even before I was thinking about this project, part of my ritual every summer is just to be aware of all of these different bits of coastline and just geologically what's going on in the area. I decided to expand the conversation a little bit to some other coastal places that are very meaningful to me. So there are a couple of different rocks from Cape Cod, one from Provincetown, and I guess 2 from the town of Sandwich, where I spent a lot of time as a kid. And then the final choice that I made was to cast a rock from a far-flung location. Some of the rocks that I made early on for this project went to Delphi and spent a few months in Greece last year. And I went to see that show so that I could see the project in its location. And I decided on site where the show was being presented to take a little rock and bring it home from Delphi and cast that as part of this group. So we have one international representation.
Fabulous. So these are not just any rocks, but these are a variety of rocks from places you know intimately. You know, it's reminiscent to me. I live in New Jersey now, and Robert Smithson, the artist, was pretty active around here and really selected rocks from very specific quarries, even in Montclair, which is just a couple of minutes from here, from the Franklin Mine area, which is in northwestern New Jersey. So these were not just any locations, but these were locations he knew very well, having grown up here in the state of New Jersey. So I feel there's like an affinity, at least a little bit, with what you're doing and sort of selecting these rocks and holding on to them and collecting them over the years, and now having kind of an idea present itself that you want to execute and casting them. So you're sort of giving them in a way, a second life, which I think is really exciting. So the rocks that you have on view are all named after these places, right? Delphi and Korea Beach and all these others, correct?
That's it. They're all named for their specific spots because I want to acknowledge where each of them came from. That feels like an important piece of this too.
I love that. I love that. So the other question I'm already getting is how do you associate? Let's talk about your color usage here, your color selection. How did you select the colors you're using? So the colors, everyone that's come in and said, these are totally Lynne Harlow colors. Like this is color, this is your palette, including fluorescents and oranges and pale pinks, which was the subject matter of your last show, where you did an entire exhibition of like that work that's up on your right side. There's a pink work on the wall there. The entire gallery of like pale pink, blush pink, Walter Gropius, Lionel Feininger selected pink. So that's represented here. But how did you go about, from those 3 original rocks that you cast with Steve, one clear, one opaque, or 2 opaque colored, how did you go about selecting the palette that's on view? That is a question that I've been getting. Everyone feels it's totally Lynne Harlow, but how did you arrive there?
The colors that I selected for each of these rocks don't have any literal translation to the places they're from. It is entirely my interpretation of the way something about that place feels to me, and also the way that exact rock feels to me. So I thought a lot about how that color would read in my hand, like holding one of these rocks, because to take a step back for a moment, a lot of times when I make larger scale work, I'm really interested in the kind of body read that we have with color. So not just what goes on like with our retinas, but just what it feels like to stand next to an orange wall, right? And so in this case, I was rethinking those kinds of feelings on an intimate scale and how it would be to hold something. It was very important to me that each of these objects would be a monochrome, because there is so much that goes on in terms of the surface action of these rocks, the way the light bounces off and filters through. So each one as a monochrome was definitely the right expression. And we played with color a lot in the glass studio to think through whether a blue was going to feel a little too much like water, a little too much like sapphire. I wanted these things to feel like nothing else, to just feel like the objects that they are. And that informed a good amount of my thinking about color. So building on my existing color choices in other work, as you say, I do tend to have a palette to a certain extent. And there were also limitations in the material. There's a very vibrant orange that I've used in my work for many years. When we made the triangle pieces in glass initially, we were able to capture that exact orange, and we made large and small scale triangles that really had that great color to them. It wasn't possible for us to get that color in the glass for the rocks. So there were so many different factors that informed these color choices.
Exactly. And there are rocks on view, just for those of you that haven't seen it, there are works that are in clear, like colorless glass, right? And then works that are tinted monochromatic colors that are translucent, meaning you can see through them. And there are others that are completely colored and opaque, which I feel is an interesting thing. Those opaque glass rocks seem to me to be the most surprising because they feel so solid. And the question I've been sort of fielding, like, I think there's a response like, are these digitally printed? Are these rocks like, are you using technologies? And I'm like, well, in a way, but not printed in the way you think that they're being produced, right?
Right.
So they function very differently, whether it's opaque or transparent, whether it has color or no color. And I think if I'm not mistaken, I think we have one orange rock in there that is opaque. Yes.
One orange that is fully opaque. There's another deeper kind of persimmon orange that almost reads as opaque, but it's not. It's actually a transparent or translucent glass that has a really dense appearance unless you hold it up to the light. And then you can see that there is that translucency to it. So that one is a little bit tricky.
Yeah, and I also want us, just because you've mentioned it now twice, Lynn, that these works you really feel about, you talk about holding them in your hand or holding them in the hand and the weight that they have. And for the sake of the show, we had to anchor everything down, which is not exactly your intention to have them all sort of set, right, for the duration of the exhibition. But the idea is that they're meant to be handled, they're meant to be held, they're meant to be touched, which is very different than other work that you've produced, right?
It's a different interaction. Of course, I've made installations where you can walk through materials, and so there's that kind of physical contact that's made, but the kind of holding that these objects allow for is completely different, I think. And one of the things I was thinking about recently in relation to this is that when we think about landscape and we talk about landscape, we often think about the idea of the sublime, right? That's something that comes up a lot. And the rocks that I have gathered from these different locations really are elements of sublime settings. And so in being able to hold these, it's inverting the sublime in a way and being able to really bring it personally to yourself. And I think that knowing that they come from such vast spaces lends themselves to this idea of the lodestar, of the guide, that
Love
they
it.
come from big places in the world and they can guide us through big places in the world.
And all through sort of one single object that can be held in the hand, which I think is really, really marvelous. I mean, they're sort of reminiscent to me of, maybe some of you are familiar with these sort of Chinese scholar rocks that are pulled out of nature and put on pedestals, and they're sitting on desks or in gardens, like a Noguchi rock is really coming out of that tradition, where they're meant to be sort of focal points for things that are much greater. You use the word sublime. That's a great way to describe this, sort of like this small rock, but the world within that rock, or the landscape within that rock, or the earth within that rock, or existence within that rock. Some really interesting ideas there. There was one color specifically. I just want to go back to the colors that you were using. And you mentioned you're collaborating with Steve, going back and forth about, have you thought about this? And I really want to do this, and this kind of iterative back and forth collaboration. But there was one color that you wanted to use, which is a type of yellow called uranium glass.
Yes.
And maybe you want to tell us a little bit about specifically what this sort of like yellow uranium glass is. And of course, I had to kind of nudge Steve along to actually start working with it. So tell us about uranium glass, because I don't want to forget that one.
The uranium glass isn't just a yellowy green color, but it does have uranium content in it. And there's a whole history of decorative glass that has used this. I know that there were Vaseline containers over the years that used this. They were kind of known for that probably 80 or 90 years ago. And it really does glow in black light. So it has one appearance in regular day-to-day light, and then you can also see it doing something really dramatic and funky in UV light. So this is a color that I've used a lot over the years. It really is a color that I love to use because it's so active. It has such a physicality to it. And when I learned about the uranium glass as an option for some of these works, I talked with Steve about it, and he was hesitant at first because it's something that he had not used himself. And I think there were safety questions for him, and he needed some time to think about that. And at first he said that he would prefer not to work with that material. And I fully understood and fully respected his answer to that. And so we proceeded with other kinds of colors, other rocks. And then a few months down the line, the question came up again. I think he was the one who initiated it and wondered if I was still thinking about that. I said, oh yeah, I'm still really interested in the idea. And he at that point had done a little more research and realized that, there's not a safety concern for the way we were going to be working with it. It's essentially encapsulated in the lead crystal that it's part of. So it's not like there's residue coming off when we're working on this. So at that point, we made one of these rocks just to see if it was going to look the way I had anticipated when it came out of the kiln. And it blew my mind. It was exactly what I was after. And so we went ahead and made several of them at that point. And I think that all of the rocks have a presence that is much, much larger than looking at the measurements on the checklist, right? That they're 2.5 by 3.5 inches, right? They feel a lot bigger. I think the uranium glass pieces do that more so than all of the others.
Yes, they feel totally out of this world, honestly. I don't know if any of you have been up to, if I'm not mistaken, the Cornell Museum of Glass in upstate New York. Anyone has been there, but they obviously are a glass museum. And if I recall correctly, a number of years ago, I saw a whole display of these very ornate, blown or molded glass vessels that were, I don't know, vases and containers for things. And they were all lit with this like, UV light. And it was quite something, but they're like a lemony yellow that fluoresces, and you've used that fluorescent yellow. I mean, even if you were to turn off your video, your background color here, Lynn, or your icon color on your profile picture on Instagram is that yellow. So this is like core to your work, going all the way back to beat in a way.
Yes.
That first project we presented. So just keeping an eye on the time, we're talking a lot. I don't want to be remiss and ignore the works on panel that you've produced.
Yes.
So you can see probably over my shoulders, there are 2 clusters of them, constellations, again, Lodestar kind of constellations that we put together. Different panels, they're all kind of birch plywood, different shapes and profiles, big and small, but nothing larger than like 24 inches. And on those panels, you decided not to paint, but rather do what? Like, what are these works on panel?
They are silk organza on panels, specifically because silk organza is sheer, and because silk is such an amazing fiber, comes in the most glorious colors, the kinds of colors that correspond to the glass objects. I became very interested in making some sort of 2D representation of the cast rocks. And I do this often with 3D projects. I will make drawings or some kind of work that isolates certain aspects of what's happening spatially and really kind of go deep and celebrate some aspect of that in a flat way. And because these rocks have such poetic kinds of silhouettes to them, I wanted to make some version of silhouettes. And I initially did some drawings and I did some paintings, and then I started thinning the paint and cutting it with different, matte medium and different products to figure out how I could still be using the transparency that the most of the glass rocks have. And I worked on this for months and wasn't feeling satisfied with the results I was getting. And then I came back to the idea of sheer fabric, which is something that I have used a lot in a lot of different arrangements and contexts over the years. And I decided that I would try cutting some of these silhouettes out of organza and chiffon and some other sheer fabrics to see if I could get the kind of results I was looking for. And that still took quite a while. There was so much experimentation involved in how to be able to make the fabric rigid enough that I could cut the fineness of the silhouette that I wanted. And then I, of course, wanted to put them on something that would make the translucency of the material visible. So putting silk organza on paper was not interesting at all. You lost that sheerness that was so key to the material. And when I tested out a bunch of surfaces that could become the support for these, the wood panels felt like the right fit. And so after a lot of experimenting, I was finally off and running with the right materials, right methods, and then I started making a lot of those.
A lot of them, exactly. It's just the sort of the technical side of it. They appear so easy in viewing them, but the amount of like tech and experimenting and trial and error that went into these works that make them appear so simple and straightforward must have been mind-boggling. I mean, I've had one viewer come in and describe them as cameos, kind of in the traditional idea, the sort of like the black silhouette cameo portraits of people, which I feel is a really interesting comparison because they're in a way sort of different vantage points of the same rocks that are on the table, which was your intention. And they're so meticulously cut out, but diaphanous, like organza, like it doesn't exist. I mean, like it falls apart, it, you know, shreds along the edges, the strings come loose. We've done enough work with presenting these over the years, Lynn, that I know this material so well. Like one little breath and it's got a crimp in it or a fold, or it's gets out of whack and it's like, you know, like fisheyeing or concaving or something. Yeah. So the fact that you got these so meticulous, the edges of these look exactly like the kind of chalk outline of a rock, and it's just marvelous what you did with them. And most people cannot understand that these are fiber works, right, that are mounted on wooden panel where the grain is visible. It's just not, it's not, you can't comprehend it. You don't understand what you're seeing, which I think is marvelous. So.
And I like hearing that someone was relating these to cameos, because really cameos are portraiture. And in a sense, these are portraits of the objects that are cast already. Clearly, I don't tend to be a portraitist generally, but in this instance, it works.
Right, and but I think that connection to sort of documenting, memorializing, creating a portrait of something that is like deeply personal and meaningful to you. People, in the case of, you know, Victorian cameos, but in this case, the rocks that you've collected from various specific sites, again, using that Robert Smithson term, I think is really compelling, like really interesting. So they complement, but they do not repeat what is available for viewing on the table. So this really interesting inversion or translation of that idea, which is lovely, 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 lovely. And Lynn and I mean, you should know this is meant to be humorous, but we have never presented so many individual objects in a show of yours ever. Like the checklist I think we put together is 10 pages or 12 pages long, where every other show we've done was one entry: light, rain curtain, electric guitar, colored light, and an amp. Right, so it was like five pieces of material in one installation. So it's been really, really cool to see how you have kind of drilled down into kind of like very specific objects. Really interesting, you know, development in the work. So very, very cool. So keeping an eye on time, you guys, we have about 15 minutes left. I'm sure you have many, 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 many questions. I will go ahead and stop talking. If you have a question, just go ahead and unmute yourself, or raise a virtual hand if that's the case, but we're sort of an intimate enough group here together. I think anyone that has a question can just go ahead and jump in. Lots to think about and chew on, of course, Lynn. Thank you for that. And I'll wait a couple more seconds here.
I do have
yes, go ahead, Sean.
Mm-hmm. It's probably just because I've been reading these books by John McPhee about geology. He's such an entertaining writer on that topic. And does the geology of these rocks enter into it? I can see how it it might not at all. But I mean, have you done any, apart from, noticing what the different materials are in the different places, have you looked into the geology, or is that just it's not germane?
I have learned the most cursory things about some of these areas, but I haven't gone deep. And I think it reminds me of very early on when I was starting to work with fabric in some of my installations. I didn't know anything about fabric. I didn't sew. I had never really spent time in the garment district. And one of the things that was so thrilling about that process was that I was walking into these fabric stores without any understanding that, oh, well, this fabric is generally used as a lining for a coat, or, that they had some intended purposes. I was able to look at all of that fabric and just say, how do I want to use that? And it's a similar sort of thing with these rocks. I'm less concerned about knowing exactly what they're made of, and instead thinking about how their essence feels to me based on the individual rock and the location that they came from. So for that reason, I haven't gone deep.
Great question for that, Sean. Yeah, the geological sort of aspect is clear in these, which is cool.
And
Other question? Oh, go ahead, Sean. I'm sorry.
Just to follow up on that, especially the age. I mean, some of these could be millions and millions of years old. But I see that that's not what it's about. So that's understood. Thanks.
But that age, that kind of mind-blowing history that these things have, is part of what appeals to me about them. So even if I don't know exactly how they came to be on that specific set of coastline, yeah, that's all woven into why they are so special.
Yes, thank you for that question, Sean. Chris, did you have a question? Looks like you unmuted yourself.
The only thing that I really felt about this is a little bit more conceptual. Is I sort of focused on the transformation where there's this stone, this rock that we don't know anything about from that flew in from outer space or wherever it came from, and then Lynne finds it, a very specific one for herself, and turns it into a man-made thing, and alters it completely into kind of a form that's how shall we say, opposite of how it came from nature. So there's a lot. Puts a lot of things in my mind conceptually about this, the stone pieces. I mean the glass pieces. So yeah, my monitor has frozen here, so I don't know if anybody.
Yeah, we can hear you, Chris. No worries.
Yeah.
Whether the video is fine. No worries. Very good question. So Lynne, do you have thoughts about this kind of idea of transformation from natural to kind of human-made work?
Yeah,
that's something that I did think about throughout the process. The idea that that I was taking a natural form, a rock form, putting it through this entirely man-made process, this highly technical process, using glass, which is essentially coming back to rock as its material, and then translating it into something that's new, but not that far removed in a way from where I started. And it's a curious relationship. It really is this merging of what is natural and what kind of man-made process can bring us back to a kind of natural form. In terms of that transformation or a translation, I'll give you an example of something else I was thinking about in the studio related to these. I think about music a lot when I'm working, because sometimes thinking about things in art terms feels a little too close and I can't always unravel my thoughts. And if I translate it into music, it makes a little more sense to me. And at one point in the process, I started to think about the idea of a cover song, and that a lot of times when a musician or a band decides to cover a song by somebody else. It's totally about honoring the existing thing, right? It's meaningful to them, most likely. They are bringing their own take to it, but with the hope that they're going to do the original thing justice. And that's totally what these rocks have been for me.
Fabulous, Lynn. Thank you. That's a great analogy. Love that. And Chris, I know that you obviously spend a lot of time in Greece, and one of the rocks that you mentioned, Lynn, is that rock you picked up. This body of work was first presented in an exhibition that happened to have been curated and placed at a cultural center in Delphi, Greece. When Delphi's obviously this cultural center for millennia. Everyone probably has heard of this place. Many of you have probably been there. I've been there. Lynn, you've been there now, and you brought home a rock that was adjacent to this cultural center and cast it and re-brought it into the exhibition. And if anyone's been to any archaeological site, you know that these were originally, what you see are ruins, which are originally rocks that have been left over, that have been found and transformed by other people into buildings and sculptures. And over the course of time and natural elements, they've been re-reduced back to being rocks again. So this kind of collaborative process, I think, is really an interesting one. So that rock from Delphi, for me personally, is a very special one because it sort of points to that kind of call and response between us and nature, us and natural forces, us and rocks, and the things that we do with them, right? And Chris, I know you've worked quite a bit with rocks. You're working on a big project in Greece right now on the waterfront in Hania, Crete, that is forthcoming, but it's essentially a circle made out of very large quarried rocks.
I was interested in black granite in Sweden. Broby, Sweden there are only a few places in the world that have jet black granite. So I've been to that quarry a number of times and working. It's incredible. But this business about picking up rocks in Greece is now punishable by imprisonment.
Yeah, this is definitely not an artifact. This is just a regular old rock.
No, not an artifact.
But well stated. But Chris, I mean, you mentioned when in our previous show, you mentioned that this quarry that you've done work in Sweden produces this very world-renowned black granite. And that black granite, you told me, was used for. I'm sorry, Chris. Oh, sorry, I think Chris might have frozen up, but he was telling me a story about how that black granite had been used for the Vietnam War Memorial in DC. So we can imbue certain materials with certain kinds of cultural meaning that I think is really interesting. And I had that conversation with Chris and Lynn. I think you're thinking of it in very similar terms, obviously different subject matter. So Joan, did you have a question? You turned your mic on.
I do. Have you considered possibly pairing up the original rocks and the glass rocks? Presenting them together?
I had them sitting together in my studio, and I find that putting them side by side kind of mutes the magic in a way. It ends up feeling too literal to look at them side by side. So I love being able to show some of the original rocks as examples of where I started, but they don't work the way I would like them to work, to present them side by side. Yeah, and I would be pretty interested. I'd be interested, in fact, to show people how they look side by side and see if maybe I'm just having a weird read on this, and if for other viewers there is something actually really informative about it. You know, we should do that.
So I was also thinking about your works on fabric and how they're sort of like the shadows of the rocks.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about Peter Pan's shadow made of organza.
Ooh.
And it just seemed like, you know, in Peter Pan, the shadow becomes an object.
Right.
And your organza shadows are also objects.
Oh, that's a great cultural reference to shadow as object. Yeah. Yeah, I think that in a similar way to Peter Pan, these shadows or silhouettes take on their own particular life and their own characteristics. So we know that they correspond to something else originally, but then they exist on their own too.
Right.
I
Yeah.
love that. Yeah, I love that, Joan. What a lovely notion. Very lovely. I have to go back and watch Peter Pan. I totally forgot that was a thing. Good. Excellent. Pat, I see you have your hand raised. Go ahead and unmute yourself, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
One very basic question.
Mhm.
Why glass? Particularly vis-a-vis a stone. A
Mhm.
stone that has density and within itself energy.
Yeah.
Unless the correlation is to crystals, which within their structure and their making, both are transparent and hold in their facets the energy. But glass, and this is a personal thing,
Mhm.
glass is so ephemeral. Glass is so fleeting by virtue of its transparency. I was very interested to hear your sense of weight, that the
Yeah.
glass has weight, which was the equalizing motion, I thought, with the object that you created. It too had weight. But I'm still wondering, there are so many other options: steel, resin,
Yeah.
just wood objects painted to look like it. There's so many other things that I'm sure you came across, but what was your sifting process with the glass? You can say.
The glass has allowed me to continue an exploration that I've been involved with for decades now, exploring how light and color and material intersect and what can happen when those are arranged in really particular ways. So even though we did go ahead and make some opaque glass objects, most of them are translucent because of the way I wanted the light to be able to move through them. So that was certainly a part of the thinking behind it. But you brought up an idea, a word that that I actually meant to bring up earlier, and that is energy. Anytime I hold one of these rocks in my hand, there's that really overwhelming sense that this is the energy of the planet in some petite form, and it holds all of that within itself. And my feeling is that what happens in the casting process and the firing process in the kiln creates a new version of that energy. So the casting itself is also a really important piece of this, whereas if I were making a wood object, for example, that wouldn't be part of the process. Does that start to answer some of what you were thinking about?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and some of the materials, Lynn, I mean, are literally lead crystal the way they're described, which is, again, that has that kind of crystal notion that you were pointing to earlier, Pat. I don't know if anyone's familiar with like Barry X. Ball's studio work. He's been carving these huge portraits out of like very high-end onyx and expensive rare stones, but he's carving them using digital technology. So they look like Renaissance kind of style portraits, but out of like onyx or something like this. And they're wild in their fabrication, as you know, probably as polar opposite as sort of like so reductive and minimal and specific to what you're doing with that translation, Lynn. So taking exotic rocks and turning them into portraits, as opposed to taking the rock and turning it into a rock. It's great.
Yeah.
I love the idea of that. So are there any questions? We are at time. So Sean, you have a question?
Well, I just wanted to say, I think it's wonderful too. It just occurred to me that in order to recreate these rocks to say what you want to say, you still had to go back to the like extreme heat temperatures and like you're kind of redoing some of the things that had to happen for the original rocks to be made themselves with huge amounts of pressure and so forth. And that's kind of cool too. It's very cool.
I felt like that was a very cool piece of it as well. And that was part of what appealed to me in this process too.
Yeah, sort of chemical heat transfer process. I think that's great. Chris, you had one final question for us. I know we're at time. So Chris, can you hear me okay?
I'd like to ask Lynn if she ever thought of, or did it ever come up to alter the scale, to take the original rock and then to an exact scale, except enlarging it in some way and making a big glass piece from it, but the exact same replica except in scale.
This is something I've thought a lot about, Chris. It is a total fantasy of mine. It's really prohibitive in terms of both weight and kiln size. So not impossible, but it would take a very, very specific type of fabricating operation to be able to do that. And I would love at some point to do just that kind of thing. I've thought about it a lot.
Yeah, so scaling up rocks or casting larger rocks to begin with, right, Lynn?
Yep,
these are two options that you could pursue here.
Things.
Very interesting. Good question, Chris.
Yeah.
So Lynn, I would like to thank you for all of your insights and sharing all the behind the scenes of how this body of work got made. And it's really exciting to hear it straight from you. I'm the one always at the gallery talking, and I try to do what you say justice, but I never quite reach what you're sort of communicating here. So I just really appreciate you being so like forthcoming about process and experimentation. And I hope all of you found it really helpful and insightful. Yes, I'm seeing nodding heads. Kira, thank you for that. Appreciate the feedback. Ben, yes, awesome. I just want to repeat that Lynn's show will be up for another few months. It's up through June 3rd. And you will be leading an in-person, I mentioned Lynn comes to the city all the time, New York City. You will be leading an in-person walkthrough at the gallery. So mark your calendars on May 6th. It's a Saturday at 3 p.m. So it's Saturday, May 6th. You're going to be doing a walkthrough, and we'll have another conversation and a chance to revisit this show in person. So if you can come, it would be amazing to see all of you there. And I just want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. I really enjoyed the conversation. These things are very meaningful to me. So thank you all for being here. And thanks, Lynn.
Great conversation.
Thank you.
Excellent, everybody. Stop by the gallery. We will see you all very, very soon. And thanks again, Lynn.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Good night, everybody.